Is God a moral monster, especially when it comes to the death of innocent people, and particularly children? That's the accusation that I heard made by an atheist recently on a TikTok video, and I just wanted to comment about this because I believe it betrays and displays the darkness of human reasoning outside of a personal relationship with God. James says in James chapter 3 that man's wisdom is earthly, sensual, and demonic. It's earthly, it's bound to this world, it's sensual, it's based on our senses, it's based upon what we can see and feel and touch and taste, and even based upon our own lusts and passions. It's skewed by these things. And then demonic, that is, we live in an environment where there are seducing spirits, and in the world there are doctrines of demons. And so James says that earthly wisdom, man's wisdom that is earthly, sensual, and demonic. And even Romans chapter 1 verse 20, it says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that mankind is without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became as fools. And so man's wisdom is limited to the earth, it's limited to the senses, and it's interfered with, and it's influenced by demonic influence, by demonic spirits. Let me give you an example. A person will argue that God is a moral monster because he allows suffering and evil, and because innocent people lose their lives, such as the death of a child. But the same person very often will argue for women's right to choose, for a woman's right to control, as they say, her own body. And so, on the one hand, they can say that it's right and moral for a woman to be able to choose to terminate a pregnancy and to take a life. But if God takes a life, or if God allows a child to die, that God is a moral monster. I remember some years ago, I was watching the Oprah Winfrey show, and the subject of abortion came up, and there was a woman there, and the storyline was that she had been poor as a single young lady, had gotten pregnant, and she went ahead and carried her baby through to term. And one of the audience members stood up and asked, did you consider getting an abortion because as a single mother you weren't able to provide for that child, and that child was going to enter the world and suffer? It just so happened that her son, who at that point was in his mid-20s, was in the audience, and she had him to stand up. This was the son that, had she had the abortion, would not be here, and at that stage of his life had already almost completed college, and earned or was about to finish his bachelor's degree. But the logic is, well, you're going to bring a child into the world, and that child's going to suffer, and that child's going to endure hardship and difficulty. You ought to terminate that pregnancy, that you have the right to terminate that pregnancy. On the other hand, if God takes a life, or if God allows someone to perish, God all of a sudden is a moral monster. But think about this. What happens to a child? Now, I'm not at all arguing for or making light of, rather, the death of a child or the loss of a child. I can't imagine any more greater grief for a parent or for a family. But let me just say, what happens to a child when that child passes on, when that child dies? Well, we learn from Scripture, and we infer from Scripture, an age of accountability. People debate about this. But there's a point in our lives where we become morally responsible. A 3-year-old that's throwing a tantrum is not morally responsible for their actions. They don't understand. When a child passes, a child immediately enters into the presence of God. Even King David said of his deceased infant child, I can't bring him back, but I will go to him. He knew that that child was in heaven. That child was with God. So again, I'm not making light of the grief or light of the loss, by no means. But what I'm saying is that when a child perishes, that child, that innocent child, enters into the presence of God. You could make an argument then, in a certain sense, that God would be more moral by taking all children on the earth before the age of accountability, because then they would be spared the suffering and the evil that we experience in this life and enter into eternal joy with Him. Of course, I don't want to make that argument, but you could make it. So on the one hand, God, if He allows death or takes a life, is immoral. But on another, if we take life because we choose to take life, if we decide that it's inconvenient, if we decide that this person would have to suffer, somehow that's just, and that's moral. It goes to show you the futility of man's thinking outside of a relationship with God.